said her participation shows a commitment to sustainability and resilience. Her trip coincided with Prime Minister Kamala Persaud-Bissessa's announcement that the U.S. has approved licenses for TNT to pursue cross-border energy exploration. Planning Minister Kennedy Swarat Singh says Trinidad and Tobago remains committed to its climate agenda, balancing economic needs with environmental protection. He highlighted the urgent need to close the Betham landfill, which he described as a dump rather than a proper landfill, warning of its harmful impact on surrounding mangroves and residents. He added that the government is looking at integrated waste management solutions while also affirming TNT's obligations to regional and international climate goals. Former travel agent Vicky Boudram has applied for bail on her remaining charge of escaping lawful custody. Her lawyer argues she has already served a maximum sentence of 3 years, but prosecutors want more time to respond. Boudram, who was recently discharged of over 100 fraud charges, has been in custody since 2016. The court is expected to rule on her bail application on October the 7th. Prime Minister Kamala Persaud-Bissessa met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Washington to deepen cooperation on security, energy, and economic matters. Both governments issued statements praising the enduring partnership between the two countries. The U.S. commended TNT's efforts to curb narcotics and firearms trafficking and highlighted collaboration on restoring stability in Haiti. Persaud-Bissessa has also backed the continued U.S. military presence in the Southern Caribbean, while leaders such as Barbados' Mia Mottley and St. Vincent's Ralph Gonzalez continue to call for the region to remain a zone of peace. Well, that's the news on the hour on WESN. I'm Sean Michael Small. Thanks for watching.
WESN.
A little bit of good news, some not so good news, some bad news, and then there's a lot of other news. Sean Michael Small, this is Talking Point in WSND Content Capital. We broadcast in HD. I don't know about the other guys. But with that said, some good news. And I would call this good news, but with an asterisk. And the asterisk is not to disqualify the news. Rather, there is indirect consequences, potentially unintended consequences, definitely unintended, but potentially they are from an indirect source. So this is not to downplay or try to disparage this action, which this is one of the things that, to me, is important. Yes, the murder rate being down, that's important. Dealing with white-collar crime, haven't really, proven we could do that. Getting the shot callers in the transnational crime network, the locals, maybe even foreigners if they come here, whatever level on the ladder they're on, haven't really seen that. But then, of course, the last thing, I guess you could say, which is major with regards to crime fighting, is actual interdiction at meaningful levels of contraband like guns. So 1 or 2 guns, that's nothing to see here. A whole haul of guns regularly, which we used to get somewhat regularly, now doesn't seem to be quite as regular, although the police are saying they're stepping up their game with the state of emergency. That's fine. But with drugs, the usual report that we get is a lot of marijuana, a little bit of cocaine. Except those times when the Americans are involved with some large shipment meant to go up the islands, in which case then, we'll have a whole report, a whole set of cocaine, and then they'll list out a whole set of international partners, which one would wonder, without them, would we get this level of drug bust? We're usually on the marijuana level, right? And that, don't underestimate that right now. Do not underestimate even marijuana taken off the streets right now. It's a hell of a way to live when you've technically made it legal, but the illegal trade is still thriving. I guess do it yourself, do it at home kits, not necessarily going to totally deal with the demand for the stuff. Of course, those who are law abiding, they will limit themselves within the laws. But at the end of the day, we buy fast food from fast food outlets for a reason. We don't necessarily always make it at home. Fried chicken and burgers, even though it's not necessarily that complicated. But if getting marijuana is a big deal right now, and I'll explain why further, but I've already mentioned it or the reasoning in previous shows. Getting almost an equal amount of cocaine is a big deal. So the police, they have revealed photos, I believe, of a large-scale drug bust. Almost $300 million worth of illegal drugs yesterday was confiscated. Colombian high-grade marijuana, estimated value, 129 million and change. But cocaine, 117 kilograms of cocaine, just about 1/10 the weight of the marijuana, which is 1,177 kilograms of the marijuana. But its street value was estimated at 163 million. This is not like the usual bust where, okay, we get a little bit of cocaine alongside with about 20 million of marijuana. This is over $100 million worth of both marijuana and cocaine. And the implication, if it is Colombian marijuana, assuming these drugs, they might not have all come on the same boat, although they look like packages that could have been on those pirogues the Americans shot at. But one would assume these drugs would generally come from the same distribution channel. They were bagged more or less the same. The cocaine was bagged seemingly a certain way, the marijuana bagged a certain way. It might even be one whole shipment, not sure, right? Seems like this is what the report says. Authorities suspected that the network was planning to relocate the remaining drugs from a hidden stash in the area to avoid detection. And they might be stockpiling the drugs because the ability to bring in more is limited. So rather than just doing business as usual, maybe they're trying to have a reserve. Not entirely sure about that, but it's a hidden stash. And at a time when there is probably the most heavy-handed approach you'll ever see to stop smuggling, to the point where we question the legality of it. But regardless of if it's going to be legal or not determined in a court in hindsight, because I don't think anyone is going to physically try to stop the situation. No one cares to physically get in the way of Israel. Who's going to do that in the South Caribbean Sea to the United States? Whether we agree with it or not, it's bound to have an effect on drug smuggling. So getting this stash takes out a not too small chunk of the supply that's already in country at a time when it's potentially harder to get supply to Trinidad and Tobago. Now, how much of it was meant to go up the islands? Because usually when we see big hauls smaller than this, that's the thought. Could this have been, perhaps they were stashing it here because they didn't necessarily want to try to take it up the islands? Or was this for local consumption? I don't know what the levels of local drug consumption is. I do know that if the drug money, and I've said this before, dries up for the local criminals, they will engage in other crime because they are not necessarily ready to give up the easy life just yet, just because their suppliers are unable to deliver. Well, they're criminals. Whether they are proficient in other crimes or not, they will attempt to engage in other crimes. We've already seen signs of that depending on how you interpret the situation. So getting these drugs, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. I'm not saying that we shouldn't get the drugs. I'm just saying, be prepared for the criminal element to have its back against the wall and potentially in some cases do things that might look very unprofessional, maybe even desperate. Because to them, it's about survival. That's essentially what some Mexican cartels told a reporter. I believe she was a reporter. With regards to, because the United States using military force against drug cartels is not something that somebody thought up yesterday. There was talk about this, particularly with regards to Mexican drug cartels, for years. So what those cartels determined that they would do is, it's not about whether they could win the fight or not. If it's about survival and their backs are against the wall, they will fight. But they also have alternative measures they could take before it reaches that point. Now, I don't know how, it's one thing for a cartel to fight against special forces that come in on helicopters with guns. That's a guy with a gun fighting a guy with a gun. It's another thing for a drug cartel to try to fight US Navy ships. But our local criminal element, they might feel like their source of ill-begotten gains, those dealing in drugs, are cut off. And psychologically, that might put their backs to the wall. And how they respond to that will be up to them. Who knows? Maybe one or two of them. I mean, I'm not expecting this, but hey, my fingers are crossed for even the slightest bit of hope. Maybe one or two of them might determine, you know what? I don't know if I'm about to take certain risks. Maybe I should walk away from all of this. I'm not expecting it to happen, but hey, even one rehabilitation is a win, right? If you could just reach out to one to turn their life around. I don't know those of you who are family members who either suspect or outright know. Things might seem hopeless, and things might get worse for those family members now, depending on how things goes, especially given the ongoing state of emergency and further efforts directly or indirectly to deal with crime. Now might be the time, maybe you could reach out and say, hey, you might have thought it was worth it then. Is it worth it now? But there will be some subsections of society, subsets, and we're talking subsets of subsets now, because an entire community in a hotspot, while yes, they might, all communities will have minor lawbreakers, but they won't all be engaged in murder and drug smuggling and the like. So it's not the whole community, it'll be a smaller set out of that community, which is a smaller set of the entire population. They might feel like they have no options at all because the system already feels, whether truthfully or not, against them. And if I understand people want social programs to deal with crime long term, and I'm saying you need both, you need law enforcement and social programs. Different cities in America prove social programs alone isn't going to do anything about it. Now, legalizing drugs worked to some extent in Portugal. Did it solve all of the problems? Maybe, maybe not. It comes with its own set of challenges and issues, right? Because we're not talking about benign substances. But perhaps now we will see, while I'm saying that we should have both hard enforcement and social programs, are our programs effective enough? And we might see, one, a missed opportunity, and two, the deficiencies of our society with regards to rehabilitation show up now if criminals' backs are against the walls and they feel like they have no option. Because it's not just, here's part of the problem. What we want is to have someone else solve the problem out of sight, to bear none of the risks, to have no skin in the game, to commit nothing of ourselves. Yes, we need to rehabilitate them and social programs and blah, 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 blah. Are you going to hire convicted criminals? That is not an easy question to say yes to. If you stand on principle and automatically say yes, it's not guaranteed to happen, but you might end up with a bad outcome. It doesn't all have to be bad, but that's the risk, right? Those who do it have courage. Do enough of us have courage? And I think it goes into our culture and our society and the expectations we have for each other. It's very interesting when you read up or listen to various cultural differences in Southeast Asia. There are certain laws that we just not going to follow as a collective, whereas as a collective, they are compelled not to do certain things. And sometimes that social pressure is not always healthy. And sometimes the lack of it causes us to have a very lackadaisical, don't care attitude. It doesn't seem like that, right? It doesn't seem like that. But that's why the Mayor of Port of Spain is looking to have new plans to deal with waste disposal in the city, because it includes litter wardens. It includes having to try to get new dustbins. They have to update. This is, when I say our laws are behind, they have to update laws to allow for the government, for the city of Port of Spain to put out plastic dustbins and not metal ones. You would think that would have been an easy thing to do long ago. Think about all the old foot metal dustbins that you would see. Public health bylaws, which have not been updated since the 1940s, have to be amended with the approval of the Ministry of Health. So anyway, that's tangential. The main thing is the TTPS, based on the reports, got a lot of drugs off the streets. In the long run, that hopefully will cause the criminal profitability and thus the networks locally, the gangs, to contract. But who knows? If they try to compensate that with violence, robberies, home invasions, and kidnappings, I'm not saying that we should regret cutting off their drug supply and drying up the drug money, but be ready for it. Hopefully the TTPS is ready for it. They won't tell us those plans if they had it, and I won't blame them for not telling us that. Now, not so good news. A police officer was shot on the early mornings, 2:45 a.m. Wednesday morning, so I believe that was yesterday morning. The only question I have is because it doesn't seem like he was on duty. So was the shooter aware that he was a police officer or not? Because he was on the roadway along Constant Street, off Skinner Street, near the PBR. Was he coming home from work? Like, I don't know what the circumstances are, so it's hard to assess what the potential motive was. It just as easily could be someone shot him who knew him and knew that he was a police officer. Now, he survived, but this is just another instance of when law enforcement agents are potentially targeted, that's a bad sign, because it means that that individual, for whatever reason, has zero respect on the capabilities of law enforcement, which in some ways is more important than the actual capabilities, because that is part of the reason why the murder rate got out of control. Because the police were perceived to be ineffective, and then when it grows past a certain point, it's actually not too dissimilar to COVID to deal with it with reasonable levels of resources and not just pumping money and trying to overhire personnel to have an overwhelming number of police officers, disproportionate to what a country of our size should need normally. Yeah, it got away from us. The fact that the murder rate has been brought down, we can't underestimate the opportunity we have to sort of reset the entire criminal justice environment, the outlook of it, the perception of it. But police getting shot is an indicator that perhaps we didn't really necessarily solve the issues, and they could flare back up. Similarly, 2 British tourists were robbed by knife points. Now, they went to the savannah. This is around 9 p.m. They were looking for food. Places were locked up. So they were coming down Picton Street after getting ice cream from the local ice cream establishment next to the savannah. They were in the vicinity of Picton Street. They were returning to their apartment. And yeah, poorly lit roadway, 2 men with knives robbed them of cash, personal devices, and other items. I'm not saying that there will be zero crime against tourists, but it's just one of those things that, one, there's no consideration given, right? At some point, criminals are not going to care about well, we already had indicators that they didn't necessarily care about the elderly, children, of course, then who's tourists? There's 2 young women apparently, and law enforcement officials, and things could go further, right? That's what this state of emergency was all about preventing. So, when it's tourists, that stuff could get out there. And if we seriously want to deal with tourism, part of it is perhaps telling tourists, hey, around 9 p.m., don't be walking down poorly lit streets. Things like that. Or if we have areas where we think tourists will relatively, to whatever the levels are, frequent. It's not like I'm talking about the Las Vegas Strip here, but there are a few hotels / guest houses in that area, right? In the vicinity of Picton Street. Perhaps a somewhat greater police presence there might be useful. Because there will always be a tourist that does not get the warning. Now, we go from the not so good news to maybe this is the bad news. Apparently, there's a subsidiary of the NGC that is owned $500 million, right? Which has led to the minister to proceed with a crackdown to get those funds. But also, he has stated that prime industrial lands was leased for chump change, as he put it. There was something about, I'm not necessarily going to go straight to corruption in the traditional sense. There was something about the management of the economy, the lack of revenue, and perhaps these improper, informal workarounds to try to get certain things done. And the problem is, in this case, it might not, the intention might not have been outright corruption, but it sure looks like it could be outright corruption. It could be laziness. It could be a laissez-faire attitude. It could be a desperate attempt to have economic activity by saying, all right, you just take the land, pay peanuts, and we'll sort it out later. But it looks like it could potentially be corruption when you do things like that without explanations. But we don't know. We don't know. We don't know for sure. The minister, not the minister, the chairman of NGC, he's come out he has these claims. A free-for-all on the land, the money he wants to get collected, all right, fine. But haven't necessarily been given more information on the actual situation of how it came to be. So, but if you just, based on what he said, based on what he put out there into the public, and then what one newspaper reported, and it could be missing important details that's already publicly known, and not being circulated, at least by this report. But usually, they'll just throw everything in there that they know of, at least. And this does not look good. And I don't know if a good explanation will be had. Probably what will happen is no explanation will be had, and then we'll just get wild accusation and speculation of coming from the government and a set of nonsense to try to disprove it coming from the opposition, and it'll just go nowhere. And there'll be very little actual meat on the bones on the matter. Now, we had the good, we had the not so good, we had the somewhat bad, now we have the somewhat confusing. The teacher who was found missing, the teacher who was missing and subsequently found missing for the second time, apparently he believed his life was in danger and went into hiding. Yeah, I'm not saying I don't believe him. I am saying I don't know what to make of it, because this is not always true. But usually, these things follow a pattern, and if you break the pattern, you tend to need to provide a good explanation as to why this is looking so different. Because more often than not, cases show that when things stray against the norm, it can be for random reasons or what have you, but usually it isn't. So, and here's the thing, if you think you are being threatened, and you've already gone through this song and dance before, you don't tell the police, you don't tell your wife, you just disappear. What is threatening you? I guess is the first question, because apparently he did not give the police, this is I'm quoting the report, he did not give the police any information on who was threatening his life, or why, or for how long. So, yeah, I don't know what to make of that. Now, last thing I'll say before we take the break, this is from Illinois Week. Chief Secretary is calling on WASA to deal with the water problems in Tobago. Now, it might have been fixed by now, but that was not necessarily, the issue itself was not what I wanted to highlight. Now, apparently, the water crisis he's speaking about is due to damage, a ruptured 16-inch transmission pipeline. All right, cool. Also, with all the rain we've been having in Trinidad, from what I understand, Tobago has not had the same level of rain in the last couple of weeks. Last weekend, I think, we had rain, they also got some rain. But there were times when we got some heavy rains before that, and Tobago didn't necessarily get that. So I was wondering if part of the issues with water supply in the island might be exacerbated by maybe not as much rain in the rainy season, I don't know. But the Chief Secretary did point that out. If we have issues in the rainy season, what's going to happen in the dry season? Here's the thing. You're working with government. This is not a coalition. I believe you're not part of the coalition, but it's kind of difficult for you to work with the PNM. I understand that. The government, made up of the coalition of interests, includes the union, that is the union for WASA. The government made promises to that union to allow WASA to continue operating as it is currently operating. They got rid of the WASA report. They seemingly scrapped all the plans Marv Gonzalez and the then Rowley administration had for WASA. They scrapped it all. They didn't necessarily go in total detail because they promised to scrap it before they got elected. Meaning they didn't go into the ministry, see what was there, find, hey, you know, this isn't that good. Let's get rid of it. No, they pre-promised that move. And from what, if my memory is correct, when the government initially brought it up, it's not as though the opposition was just pointing out red flags left, right, and center from the very beginning. But for politics' sake, it became a campaign promise that they did deliver on. And I understand they promised it. If they don't deliver on it, it'll be bad to some extent, because then what good would your word be if you're going to publicly promise something and not deliver? But the flip side to that is, you have water problems with WASA, but I thought everybody went in. Can't just call the bigger party who tight with WASA, tight with the PSA. And find out what's going on before you had allowed them up in the press. I'm not saying that special treatment should be given. I'm not saying that any sort of corrupt practices or inappropriate lines of communication should be had. But I do wonder again if we will see more instances, because the union already stepped out and I believe one of the unions threatened legal action. Might have been the PSA over some issue. That the initial threat hit the press and then hush hush on the issue until we got word everything was sorted out. Nothing to see here. Move along, move along. Unions have different interests to governments. And Tobago's interests are not necessarily always in line with Trinidad's interests, based on what the politicians involved say. I would not necessarily ascribe to that line of thought 100%. But it is true that Tobago does have needs, and the government of the day in Parliament and Cabinet should meet those needs to a reasonable degree. And since everybody over there is friends, I really don't see what the problem is. I hope there's no buyer's remorse on this situation, but I could be wrong. But perhaps this just goes to show that if you form alliance based on political reasons and not because of agreements on principles, values, ideologies, and a shared goal and passion of improving the country, because a lot of what was said for the unions, notice those promises are only for the unions. Well, when you have a coalition built on individual interests, it's hard to see how everybody else will win, because those interests are not universal. Not all of them, at least. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to daily review opposition at press conference yesterday. We'll chew into it next.
Do you need treatment for obesity or any related abdominal procedures? The community hospital now offers minimally invasive laparoscopic surgery done by an American-trained, board-certified surgeon with over 20 years' experience. Give us a call at 235-5479 for more information.
The Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist,
where good private health care is affordable.
Every time someone steps into your elevator, they trust it will carry them safely. That's why preventative maintenance matters. It protects lives and shields you from liability. It prevents sudden breakdowns that disrupt business and drain budgets. And it keeps you compliant, so you never have to second-guess safety. With Ardent Solutions, you're not just maintaining elevators, you're protecting people, preserving trust, and keeping your building moving forward.
Maybe he landed here totally by coincidence. But if by chance he's admiring your fresh coat of Benjamin Moore soft sky blue, well, that's a pretty high compliment. Coming from an expert.
Feeling drained? Struggling to keep up? It's time to take control of your wellness. On this episode of Wellness Unlocked, we're diving into the key nutrients your body needs for all-day energy and balance. With 100% or more of your daily essential vitamins, plus added chromium to support healthy blood sugar, this is complete wellness in a single soft gel. Join us as we uncover how small changes can make a big impact on your health. Don't miss Wellness Unlocked. Watch now on WESN and take the first step toward better health.
But as I just said, you have to go to Venezuela and negotiate with Venezuela, the owners of the gas. It is absolutely no secret the position and the stance of this government, and in particular from the voice of the Prime Minister, towards our closest neighbor and the government of Venezuela. And if Munilal doesn't know it, the Vice President of Venezuela is also the Minister of Energy in Venezuela now, and the person in charge of these resources, and her name is Delcy Rodriguez. And it is the same Munilal who wrote to the United States government asking for Dr. Rowley and Stuart Young to be sanctioned for meeting with the Vice President of Venezuela, who is now the Minister of Energy, Delcy Rodriguez, who they have been in a to-and-fro fight with in a most disrespectful manner over the last weeks. On this occasion, it is 3 hands that have to clap, not 2. And it is the same Delcy that every week we went to Parliament, I had to be hearing from them as they hurled abuse at us on our side about our interactions with the Vice President of Venezuela and the Minister of Energy.
I mean, it's totally contrary to everything that has gone on over the last couple of months. But what it really tells us is the significance of diplomatic relations, is the significance of sovereignty, and the significance of the region being a zone of peace. You know, and that's why we have to be so very, very careful about what you say. Because here it is that you are now taking a 360-degree turn, and you're now saying that the same Venezuela that you said all sorts of things about, and that is the identical country that you're going to now to deal with.
The only gas that is readily available that would satisfy Trinidad and Tobago's energy sector, as we have said in the PNM administration for years, is that cross-border gas, and in particular the Dragon field. I have come here and very carefully listed some of the potentials that you need to look at to make this a reality. The Prime Minister, you all will recall it yesterday in a release, did not even mention Dragon. It was Secretary Rubio's office that talked about Dragon. I'm also telling you, they have not obtained an OFAC license because it is not the Secretary of State or the State Department that issues that. That comes from the Department of Treasury and a particular office. Of course, Secretary Rubio will have a huge say, if not the say, as to the administration's position. But we got OFAC license. That's why I'm telling you all, in January 2023, we got one where they set out the terms, found that to be unworkable, went back whilst negotiating with Venezuela, making applications for amendments, etc. That came in October 2023. So until that is in hand, they don't even have a starting point with Venezuela. And I suspect I know what they're counting on, because I saw it sort of mentioned somewhere. I think they're counting on the relationship with the energy companies. But ultimately, the energy companies will not determine Venezuelan government's policy and what they do with their gas. Correct? Because I was the one who brought them to the table. And during those several negotiations, there were occasions when the Venezuelan government was very prepared to say another operator. And we are the ones who held it together. So the relationship with the government of Venezuela is what is key and critical in making this a reality and a successful one.
Relationships. International diplomacy is not always as idealistic as a lot of public persons would want to make you believe. At the end of the day, whose side do you take in the matter? Because, as Stuart Young said yesterday, in this situation, 3 hands have to clap. It's not just us and the Americans. It's not just us and the Venezuelans. It's us and the Americans and the Venezuelans. All have to, some extent, agree. Otherwise, this ain't going nowhere. Now, Dr. Rudal Munilal, he has said that this deal will advance with peace once the United States issues the necessary license from the Office of Foreign Assets Control. So that's more or less confirmation that we don't have an OFAC license. We just have a non-committal. Trinidad will not be forgotten. Trinidad will not be harmed. It's on that level, right? It's not too dissimilar to what Stuart Young got earlier in the year. So there is, I wouldn't say vindication, but he's justified to say they're celebrating something that they poo-pooed on. But Dr. Munilal is saying, let me say that I've said before and I've said repeatedly that we'll work with all stakeholders. The government of Venezuela is a critical stakeholder here, of course, given the circumstance of the Dragon Project, and we are willing to work with all stakeholders, and we have demonstrated that, right? To be fair to the Prime Minister, what has she said with regard to the United States and their actions in the Southern Caribbean? And by the way, I do find it cute that the Caribbean nations want to claim waters that are not necessarily anywhere close to their sovereign territory. But anyway, the region, right? Does that include, can we dictate what goes on in the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America? I don't know. What do you call it these days? But the Prime Minister did, however, and this is what I hope she would have leaned in more on and set her tone based on this statement. She's all for Americans going after the drug cartels, but not about regime change. Her tone did not seem in line with that philosophy, but that was the literal words that she said. She was not necessarily all for an attack against Venezuela. She was not offering Trinidad and Tobago as a base to attack Venezuela. She was against that. But she was all for going after the drug cartels. The problem is she was so gung-ho about going after the drug cartels, and a lot of people are not necessarily willing or able to conceptually split various aspects of an issue. I have seen that throughout history. That's why there's such a political divide in America, Trinidad and Tobago, United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, etc., etc. Because if this is on your side and I disagree with it, then every concept, ideology, policy decision on your side has to be bad. She is for part of what the Americans are doing. But her tone has been interpreted as gung-ho cheerleading America. And I do wish she would have been more careful with her tone not being so gung-ho, because while I do think she's being misconstrued, it is very understandable why. It is a natural human reaction that while I disagree with that natural human reaction, while I think we should rise above that natural human reaction, it doesn't negate the fact that it happens. It's very real. If you seem enthusiastic about something, hell, even on this very issue, people didn't necessarily understand where I was coming from. They wanted me to pick a side and stick to that side, and I was like, I'm not really picking a side. There are things that I want to see, there are things I don't want to see, and it's not so clear-cut and simplistic as how regional leaders would like to make it out to be. And it's not always a bad thing that they are being oversimplistic, because if that's their priority, and they're willing to live with the transnational crime, that's the implications, if they're acting in good faith. Ralph. But the messaging has not necessarily been clear. And then, to compound the problem, because the Prime Minister said, we have good relations with Venezuela, which I wonder, did you say that with a straight face, Madam Prime Minister, or did you give us like a hint, wink, wink, fingers crossed while you said it? And it's not to say that it was wrong for her to say that. If things are bad, she can't admit it, because if she admits it, publicly, we lose all pretense, right? And it makes it harder to fix the situation. So she has to say, she has to be positive about it, right? But that doesn't mean that it is a positive situation. And of course, Dr. Munilal is saying, we'll get a deal done. But then there was the wild card 2 weeks ago that we spoke about yesterday. And I don't necessarily want to go, too deep into what Philip said. But one of the things that he said repeatedly, it was really 40 minutes in that video that came out. I think it was reported, the date that was reported may or may not have been accurate because it came out on a Friday a little over 2 weeks ago. One of the names he brought up in a very, well, there was an issue that the opposition had reasonable cause to criticize the then government at the time. And this is during COVID. And I think Philip was wanting to take that issue and run with it in the manner of how a lot of our local political commentary is, which is a lot of bombastic statements, right? And here's the thing with bombastic statements. It can be a sign of courage because even the clip that we showed, the quote that was in the papers, Philip, don't say it, right? So to him, he's saying things that are true that people don't want to say. But part of what he's saying is not necessarily statements of facts. It's more like a bubble debate, a court of public opinion rant. You'll see this all over YouTube, right? And the name that he frequently brought up was Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Venezuela, who's also now the Minister of Energy, apparently. So here's the thing on why the origins of the rant was not necessarily wrong, but this inconvenient truth might come back to bite the government in its dragging negotiating rear end. Way back in the day, and it's not that long ago, right? But the then Keith Rowley administration apparently met with Delcy Rodriguez as part of a Venezuelan contingent that came here. But that was a problem because based on a treaty that we were a signatory on, Delcy Rodriguez is subject to travel sanctions that are binding on all Rio Treaty parties, and TNT is a party to the treaty. This is from the United States Embassy. So the US Embassy said that we violated that treaty when she landed in our country. And what makes it worse is, at the time, similar to the meritless situation, the government, or in this case, Stuart Young, apparently denied knowing beforehand the identities of the delegation coming, except the Ministry of National Security document, well, a document was surfaced on social media that sanctioned the exemption of the Venezuelan vice president and her team's trip to TNT. And I believe that exemption was with regards to our border closure. Now, her getting an exemption to come to TNT during COVID, that wasn't the issue, at least not to me. Them trying to hide it, there's smoke. United States Embassy saying we broke a treaty, that's fire. Because if it was a situation where they didn't do anything questionable, then they should have been upfront with it. Because I have no issue. What you want to negotiate with a foreign country? Okay, let them come. Exceptions need to be made for travel in order for certain functions to happen. I get that. You can't lump a foreign dignitary that you want to negotiate with everybody else, because this, in part, is to deal with the long-term prospects of our economy. Of course, the exemption situation wasn't necessarily handled very well. I'll more on that in a bit. So this compounds an already sore spot for the public. So I get it. The opposition, which was the UNC at the time, they had reason to criticize the situation. But then when Philip comes and keeps talking about Delcy, you swear you're in love with the woman. Anyway, I'm sorry. I don't want to make it necessarily about disparaging Philip, because I do believe, look, there was legit concerns. The issue is she is not just the VP, but also the Minister of Energy. And he was basically speaking about the VP of Venezuela, almost how you would speak, if not exactly how, one politician in his country will speak about a politician of the opposing party. So in this case, how someone like him would speak about a PNM politician. Because that's the pattern of our politicians, how he deals with social media, how he deals with speaking about opposing politicians. And he's not that out of pocket when you think about our political landscape. He's not unique in that respect. And that's generally how our politicians base their interactions with each other. And then it will sometimes slip out into how we deal with the outside world. So now the government is in a very interesting position, because Delcy Rodriguez, being the Minister of Energy, if we want to deal with Venezuela, that's who we have to go to. And Venezuela itself, apparently, a media house, contacted representatives of the Venezuelan government. They have a wait-and-see approach, because part of the issue is, why will they give up their gas if they're not going to be paid for it? In kind, they don't want in kind. They want cash. They want benefits. Natural gas is not, like giving us sand. They're not giving us wood, and even then, wood could be expensive. They're not giving us cornmeal. They're not giving us grass. They're not giving us salt water. It's natural gas, a finite, valuable resource. And because it's finite, that's the key thing. It's not as though they manufacture natural gas by taking 2 parts sand, 3 parts water, and some cocoa leaves, and boom, natural gas. Their supply, like everyone else, is finite. So when you give away oil and gas resources, that's a loss that you won't necessarily make back. You could earn other money, but the value of the resources in your land is finite. That's a loss. So that alone, the uphill battle, just because of how the Americans have positioned the issue right now, is understandable. When you add the bubble to it, it potentially seems insurmountable. So it's very, very interesting that the report is not necessarily including the back and forth necessarily between the political messages from Trinidad politicians and Venezuelan politicians about Trinidad as they exchange things. I believe a Venezuelan politician, even referred to the talk about Kamala's drinking habits. Let me put it that way. I'm not wanting to propagate that, right? The point is it reached a Venezuelan politician. I believe it was the defense minister. It reached him. They also were shooting shots in the gutter. So, but beyond the initial statements from the Secretary of State and the political bubble between government politicians and Venezuelan politicians, there are some experts that believe the relationships can be repaired. I don't necessarily know exactly why they think that. The only thing I could think of is if Venezuela wants resources and they will try to negotiate a better deal for themselves, but that depends on if the Americans will go for it, right? Because the U.S. State Department, today there's a report, they are not moving from the position that Nicolas Maduro is not the legitimate leader, 1, and 2, he is a fugitive from the United States justice system. This is from the agency's chief deputy spokesperson, not necessarily from Marco Rubio himself. But then there's a third thing on top of that. Locally, there was a ruling by our High Court judge with regards to an American company, I believe it was, that basically, because of everything that went on with the privatization of their assets, our court had two injunctions that suggest proceeds from any potential drug and gas deal will go directly to ConocoPhillips and not to Venezuela because of the rulings that came out from the local legal action. So even if the U.S. State Department will potentially agree to Venezuela being paid, then there is our local courts that said, hey, but money from that deal, because they took the assets from this company gets to take their money. Because the money is technically coming from our jurisdiction, and our courts made that ruling, unless it's overturned. I don't know how we ignore that per se. It's an inconvenient truth. There's a lot of obstacles to get this dragon deal moving. But as Stuart Young said, and he's right on 2 points, or right on 1 point. Well, he's right on 2 points. One, we ain't get no deal done yet. There's no OFAC license, nothing is set in stone. We just have the Secretary of State maybe saying what the administration's intentions are. It's in a better position than it was a few months ago. Maybe. They're not really revealing any affirmative information there. But then there's the fact that Dragon is the best, most convenient, most efficient, most cost-effective, fastest solution to that conundrum of not enough natural gas. Guyana, Suriname, Grenada, anybody else, it's not going to be as quick, it's not going to be as cost-effective, it's not going to be as efficient, etc., etc. And that's where the government is on a rock and a hard place on this issue. And it makes me wonder, a lot of their initial statements on it, was it well informed enough? Or was it our local political back and forth that got the better of the government when they basically said, because of politics, we can't be seen following up on a PNM project? All right, let's take a break. When we come back, I'll dip into the rest of the press conference. A lot of things were said. I generally agree with Stuart Young on the Dragon stuff, but there was other things. And I'll just get into that before we open these phone lines, so stay tuned. We'll be right back.
If these walls could talk, they'd cry uncle. They didn't plan to become offices or yoga studios. But they've stood by us, even when we got a little stir-crazy. For that, they deserve some thanks. They deserve Benjamin Moore.
Struggling with heart health or frequent migraines? Discover the simple steps to reclaim your energy and vitality.
We're diving into a topic that affects about 422 million people around the world: diabetes.
Tune into Wellness Unlocked, the series that delivers expert advice, practical tips, and inspiring stories to help you take control of your health and well-being. Your health matters. Don't miss Wellness Unlocked. Watch now on WESN and take the first step toward better health.
I am Dr. Delphina Ovid, your friendly neighborhood dentist. At Community Hospital Dental Clinic, we offer examinations, which include x-rays, basic oral cancer screening, and a treatment plan. We also offer cleanings, fillings, extractions, root canal treatment, and complete and partial dentures. Remember, you don't have to brush and floss all your teeth, just the ones you want to keep.
Give us a call at 235-5479.
The Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist,
Where good private health care is affordable.
All right, so the opposition at press conference yesterday, as I said, so the first part of what Stuart Young had to say dealt with Dragon. And I, for the most part, couldn't disagree with him. Maybe he got a little too cheeky with the language he used, how he framed his arguments. But for the most part, on a factual basis, I can't necessarily say that, everything he said was rubbish, right? And a lot of what he said, we also said yesterday for similar reasons. And it just, when I look at it now, one day later, there's even more reasons. But he did speak about the situation, well, the ruling with the border closure policy. And I'm not necessarily going to go into the nitty-gritties and details and try to rehash the arguments. All I'll say is this. He might technically be right, because he's saying the ruling was about not disclosing the policy for a limited window, right? And it caused confusion and it was unfair, et cetera, et cetera. He might technically be right, but the problem is I think he's missing the boat on the issue and why people disliked him for it and the PNM administration for it. Because, and they're saying, one of the headlines, I think this frames it well from what I'm trying to say. We were trying to save our population, because that was part of what we were saying. And I did say that. I said, yes, initially, we didn't know what was going on, and he said that yesterday. The problem was, that's fine for the initial part of it. But as things went on, first of all, why did you not reveal the policy up front? Why did you want to play close to the vest? Did it give, and people will perceive it as giving the government wiggle room to do funny business because they're not transparent. So there's a perception that there was unfair treatment at the time. Get our people in first and let the peasants wait. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying that's more or less the perception. So now being defensive about it and wanting to be a rules lawyer, well, that's not really what happened. This is what happened. So it's not as bad as you think because you're interpreting wrong. When people are upset with you and you want to be a rules lawyer, and listen, it's human nature. When I was younger, I did it a lot more. I probably still do it now, but I try not to, or at least if I'm doing it, I try to be aware of it so I could stop. Because there comes a point where you get diminishing returns. There comes a point where it seems as though you're just giving excuses. And to me, as much as the first part of his presentation wasn't bad, it was pretty good. It was the Stuart Young of old when it came to the border issue with COVID. Because let's not forget, we are trying to save a country. That's nice, but it rings very hollow when the maritime borders, there's nothing to suggest that they were ever secure during the lockdown period. Ever. Ever. So the whole, we were securing a population, but illegal immigrants that were unchecked during a pandemic were potentially coming through unmitigated. How is that supporting a population? Illegal guns and drugs were coming through, and the people who were bringing it, of course, they were not necessarily checked. How is that securing a population? And that's why people feel victimized on top of the lack of transparency. And instead of acknowledging the faults, saying the apologies, and not being so defensive that you come across as an unlikable person, you were defensive and came across unlikable on this issue. I'm sorry. To me, it's not that big of a deal in one sense, because I didn't suffer through any of it, and I didn't know anybody who suffered through it. So I need to not necessarily allow my personal opinion to impact the matter. And I am defensive of the government on certain aspects of COVID. Even this week, when I tried to tell someone, this thing with the border closure had nothing to do with the Ministry of Health people. In fact, Seo Jung himself even confirmed that. He said it was the technocrats in the Ministry of National Security, not the Ministry of Health. So I appreciate him for saying that. But again, it's one of those lack of transparency things, because they operate, political parties operate a certain way. And I'm probably going to say this a lot in, and I've said it a lot already for the last couple of weeks. They operate a certain way. They don't have to explain everything to anybody because the diehards love them. But the population are not diehard supporters. And they don't always understand or appreciate the difference. To manage the expectations and the support of non-diehard persons is not the same thing. You need to be more transparent. You need to be more upfront. You need to be more willing to not necessarily defend a situation that the people don't like. They don't want to hear excuses. They want to be led. They don't want to be blamed. And excuses, to some extent, blames the people for not seeing things how you see it, so you must be wrong. The problem is with you, not with me. That's not leadership. There's times when you have to put misguided people in a place. But then there are times when, if you're the reason why they're misguided, who really should be put in their place? Now, let's move on to some of the other speakers. Colm Imbit also spoke. He spoke on the S&P situation. Generally speaking, I'm not going to assess how accurate he was or not. He did point to three things: the Revenue Authority being shut down or scrapped, the Dragon gas deal not working out, and the property tax being, well, scrapped or suspended, right? Those things were not necessarily blamed directly in the S&P report, but I believe they were all mentioned. But what was said is the lack of an absence of fiscal consolidation to reverse a rising government debt burden, plus limited progress in strengthening public institutions to boost fiscal revenues. That could be an indirect reference to the BIR custom situation. Spending discipline, diversification of the economy, and restoration of fiscal and external buffers. Limited progress in those things as well. So, is that the be-all and end-all in the S&P report? That's what the former minister of Finance is saying. When he started, it came across a lot better. As time went on, every now and then, a little bit of the jabs and the jokes and the sarcasm came out, and it detracted from the validity of his message. I'm willing to go with the technical content of what he said. I didn't like the little subtle jabs. It was unnecessary. When he was being serious and when he was being factual, it came across a lot more professional and a lot more effective. And I'm saying that because I'm trying to encourage that type of behavior. It's not about whether I support the PNM or not. Support when politicians do good, hopefully they repeat the behavior. But I'm not necessarily saying everything he said was 100% true. Now, the government has an opportunity to respond. I hope they respond to what he said and not respond to him and make it about what did Imbit do. Forget that. He made some technical claims. They might be true, they might not be true. Respond to that and leave the bubble out of it, which is what I wish Mr. Imbit did 100%. He didn't do it 100%. He did it partway. So, Dr. Brown, on the other hand, it's interesting. He is a proponent of the zone of peace, as was the opposition leader. My thing on it is, look, at this point, I'm going to have an ideological difference with some politicians and other commenters on that whole Venezuelan-US thing. I'm going to have an ideological difference. It is what it is. I'm not necessarily going to then, because of that, want to say everything Imbit Brown said is a pack of rubbish because, I disagree with him because he's stupid. All right, we have a difference in ideology. He was speaking to the professionalism of the Prime Minister on the UN stage. Now, I don't know if I fully agree with him on that, but I could see where he's coming from. He himself, however, at times, while he used a more professional tone, there was still attacks in it. he himself might not necessarily appreciate that, but it was still a certain level of bubble. It was just a lot more professional and graceful and sophisticated sounding. I understand wanting to be affirmative in your messaging and not, you know, acting as if you're sitting on your friends so you're hedging your bets. But I think we have too much of a strong reaction. And the language goes, even if it's a little too far, it's still too far, because what's going to happen is it's going to turn people off to your message. So then you have to ask, is the goal to encourage better professional behaviors on the international stage and in foreign relations, or is the goal to point fingers and say, hey, you was doing it wrong, and we don't actually care for you to be better? Now, Sir Young did say they want the government to succeed, and I get it. It takes two hands to clap, right? The UNC doesn't really have a track record of cooperation or compromise with the PNM on their end, because they could attempt to do it and the PNM failed to show up, and then we will say, well, it's all the PNM's fault in this case. But that's usually not what happens. Usually both sides don't really make an attempt, and I'm left basically like, what's going on? Dr. Brown, there was some things there that he said that I wouldn't necessarily disagree with, but it started to get lost to me the more and more he would throw in barbs and jabs and subjective statements on people and persons, as opposed to trying to stick to the technical objective of what he was getting to. How do we relate with other foreign countries? Because yes, to some extent, I can't disagree with him. The Prime Minister, Philip Edward Alexander, and others, sometimes bombastic statements that you would do domestically, let's keep that out internationally. And things you say domestically, if it refers to an international situation, don't expect it to not get out there. This is the internet age. A quick Google search, everybody's probably doing it. Venezuelan government, what are they going to Google search? Venezuela. What's in the news? TNT, geographically speaking, is right next door. So they're going to get some of our articles if we mention their name. And then there was the opposition leader herself. And I'll be honest, the parts before, because she spoke last on her specific things, but when she spoke with Stuart Young on, I believe this is the dragon issue, she came across a lot better. Now, I get climate change, all of that, but I don't really think, as much as there are young people who are very much in belief of all of that, and as much as the Prime Minister, she said what she said, and she probably could have said it a much better way. The fact of the matter is, Germany said climate change. What climate change? Get the coal mines open, because we're not going to freeze to death. The climate agenda is an agenda. And we can't necessarily now sacrifice too much of our own needs for an environmental agenda upon which our decisions do not have as great of an impact as we would think. That's the real dilemma. And to some extent, that's why her calling for the region to speak about climate change is understandable. It's not about us trying to meet any sorts of goals with regards to emissions and stuff like that. We're small. We are small players. It's about us pointing this out to the large players and voicing our concerns. Because God is a Trinity. But hey, even God let his son suffer a little bit. Just saying. What about the rest of us? We ain't exempt. We ain't more special. But I don't know if it's a stylistic mismatch. There were parts that just did not work for me. I don't know if the issue was just not strong enough compared to the other more pressing issues that was brought up by the other speakers. And there was a disconnect there for me with regards to the opposition leader. I don't necessarily know exactly what it is, because I'm not one of the people who say automatically because she's not charismatic, she's bad. But unfortunately, and this is somewhat true, there is a person who predicted the American elections successfully over the last few election cycles. And basically, it's the charismatic one wins. Clinton, he was more charismatic. Bush Jr., more charismatic than Gore. Obama, more charismatic than the people he ran against. Trump, more charismatic than Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris. Well, Kamala Harris, maybe not so much. It wasn't that clear-cut. Biden, that might be, well, it's hard to say, right? Is not, at times, not forming full sentences. Is that not charismatic? So what does that say to the opposition leader? I don't know, because what we need is someone to steady the ship. But I don't know if, it's funny, I don't know if we're mature enough for a mature politician. And then if she tries to be something she's not, I don't think it's going to work out well. So overall, what did I think about this whole thing? I thought that this, as it says, this press conference here from the opposition overall was an opportunity because they started to do it. They were doing it in certain ways. The government has had its moments that were controversial the last couple of weeks. If we come now and appear and sound and be more steady, more professional, less rah-rah, less bacchanal, if we come now with a more calm, even-keeled approach, stick to the facts, depend more on logical reasoning than emotional arguments, it was an opportunity to start to rehabilitate the perception of the PNM, rehabilitate the perception of some of the people involved, particularly the individual speakers in this press conference. At least 3 out of 4 have not been hated throughout their political career. And at the end of the day, Mr. Imbit has had his moments that was not all that bad. They could have done it, but I think they came up just short of really starting a change in direction that could have potentially be the beginning of a shift in local politics to get things on a better track. And it's not just, oh, well, it's good for the PNM. In theory, if a political party actually tries to be professional, and here's the thing, being fact-based, everyone thinks, oh, I'm based on facts. I don't care about logic and facts. Everybody thinks that they are facts. No, most things that people follow, most arguments that people cling to, it's based on emotions. That's why when you're confronted with someone that disagrees with you, you're quick to be defensive and emotional in how you object to their views because they have to be wrong. And if anyone has to be wrong, if anyone, you automatically deem them to be wrong, and you automatically think that they are wrong and evil for all of this strong emotions over the situation, keyword emotions, you're not necessarily being based on fact. Now, of course, if it's the case that someone wants to argue, no, the sky is red, something that's obvious and self-evident, well, not necessarily self-evident, but self-evident based on the labels that we've put, that's different. But a lot of times we misconstrue what a fact is. Donald Trump has a certain appearance. That is more or less a fact. Donald Trump is a subjective opinion here. That's not the same thing. Right? This is the issue. This is the root cause. A lot of the times when it comes to speaking about issues, what we get are opinions. Because do we have all the data? Did we account for all the variables? Did we compare it to control? Then is it facts we're speaking of, or is it subjective conjecture? And a lot of times, that sells headlines, that gets clicks on the internet, and that goes viral or gives politicians more mileage than being boring, fact-based people. That's why Gore lost, Romney lost, McCain lost, Clinton lost, although a lot of people might not like Hillary. So, we have to go out on the line. Good morning, caller. You're on the air. Caller.
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
Right, Sean, a couple of issues, and I really don't like to compare various radio stations and TV stations, but there was an interview on CNC3 yesterday, and I think that should be played several times. Is another perspective on the whole of the CARICOM issue with respect to Guyana and everything that is happening now. The gentleman name that was interviewed is Mike Singh, and I did the research on him, and he seems to be, he's a Guyanese, and he's the CEO of IT global company, Subsea Cable and thing. And he gave us perspective of how CARICOM leaders are dealing with the Venezuela, American, and by extension, all of CARICOM. And what he said, and it is mind-boggling, not only mind-boggling, it's eye-opening, a different perspective on two of the CARICOM leaders. The Barbados leaders, Mrs. Mia and Rav Gonzalez. And he likened them to a Norwegian politician, Vidkun Quisling, who is said to be a traitor to the Norwegian people, basically selling them out to the Nazis. And that is what he likened Mia and Ralph Gonzalez with respect to the St. Vincent Accord, where Maduro met with Irfan Ali. And what he's saying, they basically was complicit and not wholly supporting Irfan Ali in that accord. And from his utterances, I gathered that he was saying they undermine Irfan Ali. And what he's saying, they are not serving the best interests of CARICOM. And he said they are self-serving and they only think about themselves. And he likened the Petrocarib deal as one of the issues, getting free oil at the expense of proper sovereignty within CARICOM. And I want to juxtapose that with the Petrocarib and how it impacted on Trinidad. That was one of the reasons that Petrotrin was there. That is a market we lost. And we could say what we want. We will give them a bad deal and we could continue to be part of CARICOM, who possibly doesn't want us to play a leading role. I believe we have to retain CARICOM and our relationship with CARICOM. And I'm hoping that that clip and that interview with Deja and CNC3 is repeated so people will get a better perspective how people think about the relations and particularly the leadership of CARICOM as in its current form. I'm going to have a nice morning.
Thank you, Paul. First of all, I'll agree that I think CARICOM did not support Guyana enough, and I believe that more or less undermines CARICOM as a unit. So when people want to say, oh, betraying CARICOM, fracturing CARICOM, that was done well before. When the rubber hit the road, when the fat's in the fire, we melted. Comparing it to someone who betrayed their country to the Nazis, that's going too far. And I think, yes, he's from Guyana, so he's going to be emotional, but I think he runs the risk of losing people on the argument, because if you want to have an analogy, you can't just take an extreme analogy because you're upset about the situation. This is not quite that bad. Right? I have more to say, but we have a money line.
Arima, we'll take the call. Good morning, caller, you're on here. Morning, Sean.
Morning.
Morning. No, it missing me. But a couple of weeks ago, didn't our Prime Minister regard Mr. Maduro as a narco-terrorist?
Yes.
That was the tone I was hearing.
Yep.
And I rejoicing that the dragon did. And now the OFAC license has been reinstated. Is that the same narco-terrorists we are going to deal with now? Politics really have a morality of its own.
Well,
but what I really called to tell you this morning is about the upcoming budget. Now, in one sense, you could understand why PNM was offering 5%. But what I would say is this. If the government decides to pay that 10% to public servants, see how we're going to happen. You see the water, you see the subsidies for the water rate, electricity rate, fuel, and cooking gas, them foregone. And even though they're talking about removing contract and filling the vacancies and all of that, not much vacancies can be filled. So we, the people, have to be prepared to suffer because there's a poverty trap we're going to end up in. Because we're working for more money, but the real value of that money is going to be less than what it is right now. So we have to be careful going forward. But other than that, I still want somebody to explain to me the grandstanding by the Prime Minister and Philip Alexander. Because now you have to go back to the same Venezuelan people to ask them for permission to drill for the gas in their waters. Whether we have a license with them for 30 years or not, agreement, they could say no. Because right now America is intimidating them. You see, yeah, you just have to play the hand that you're dealt with, right? But you have to be smart and clever at the same time. And I'm not seeing that with how this country is being managed at the moment. I want to leave you with this one. Now, in my school, we have people retiring, right? So vacancies being left. The administration in school have to go up on the substitute teachers register to get substitute teachers. You know, over the August, no vacancies were filled. You know, on the first day of school, the ministry recalled all the substitute teachers. So they were out of school for about 3 or 4 days. And it already had timetable set for them because they didn't send no vacancies in the first place. But these things don't make the news. And I find that to be rather strange. Because on one hand, you ain't fill the vacancies, and on the second hand, the people who doing the job. Because your responsibility to fill the vacancies in the first place. And you didn't do it. So instead of carrying the education forward, we're really going nowhere. Thanks for the opportunity. Have a good day. Or listen off here. Stay safe.
Thanks, caller. One of the things is teachers can't speak out. School staff can't speak out. They just can't speak to the press, from what I understand. This is since COVID, right? Similar to doctors in the public health system. If you're part of the union, then you could potentially use that platform to speak out. Now, with regards to schools, this is where the NPTA needs to, I don't know if they can do more, but based on how things are, I don't know who else you could turn to, right? As a group to organize and to collate information and to craft public notices, essentially. Of course, it's the NPTA, but still, it's a potential advocacy group that could collect the information and then release it in an organized way, in a way that would be regular and could maintain expectations that it sets and not just be a flash in the pan, because people don't respond to flash in the pans And that's why third parties aren't a thing here, right? You're not seeing the marginal country good enough. The one thing with that, the one caveat with that, although I am very disappointed with that body camera nonsense. Tell me you don't care about body cameras without telling me you don't care about body cameras. Armor over cameras, and then, oh, well, we got the armor. But, you know, this camera bill here, that's way too much. That's way too much. You know? We need to put integrity. We need budget integrity, not quality integrity. We need budget integrity. That's an oversimplification, but the one thing though is there's the whole thing about waiting for the budget. They were put in a very, very bad financial position. And at least with the PNM, if they were re-elected, they would not be starting from scratch. And ironically, the campaign promises that look like we probably can't afford them, not necessarily restructuring WASA, giving out 10%, so on and so on. Those promises, the cost to do them, as you implied, might be so high, so now they compound their difficulty. We're not giving you 5%, we promised you 10%, right? So you make a bad situation, a difficult to figure out situation, even worse. And I have more to say, but we have Claxton in the line. Good morning, caller, you're on here. Meet your TV, caller. Meet your TV.
Good morning, Sean.
Morning, morning.
Good morning, Sean. Yeah. You know, you see what I'm trying to say? I am all waiting patient for the budget. Because you know why? I believe if she decides to give that 10%, she will be making the people know. That might be the only time she was able to tell the truth. That if only get 10%, about 40 or 50,000 workers will lose their job. And that is what the last government was telling them. You understand? They was telling them that. But they didn't believe. But you see, when we greedy, we're selfish, and we don't want to understand. And one of the things happen to the people in this country, they don't look overall. They don't watch the world. What's happening to the world today will come down to us because we are linked up in that. So that's why all this trouble. But you see, when people like to lie, that is the only way you can see it, you know. When you lie for power, you lie, you want to be in position. You understand? You give people all kind of story. You tell them, the sky, I will bring the sky for you. And you're going there now, and you're seeing, but wait now, boy, we really can't do that. You understand? We can't do that, you know. And then things what would help you, like the property tax. You don't want to take that because you don't want your people to pay nothing. So don't pay nothing. Give them the impression that your thing will pay nothing. But you have a public service, which is about 90,000 people, which bring in no revenue. And, you know, I don't know if you, Sean, or many other people asking the Prime Minister, where are you getting the money from? Where are you getting the money from? You understand? But they just keep saying, yeah, we will get, we will pay, we will get from. You understand? This is the kind of things you hear when you ask, where are you getting the money from? You understand? But Sean, you see, we going down a road that people don't know. We're going to end up with some kind of hardship in this country here. All because of stupid people. That is the simple way you can pay it. Because as a government, you must have some common sense, like they say, Patrick Manning say, a level head and common sense. There are things that you have to do. You understand? There are things you just have to do. But if you want to make the people believe that, hey, I want to govern for just a certain set of people, it will never happen. We all need each other in this situation. And Venezuela, you see how it come back? She had to go right back to Venezuela. You understand? If I was Maduro, I'm telling you, Sean, if I was Maduro, me even want to hear Shelo, because you know, I will not have no trust. You understand? That people when they're talking from both sides of the mouth, I will not have no trust in that woman. I will not want nothing to do with that. Thank you.
Thank you, caller. Let's take the comment now because it ties into some of the. Caller, they just gave back the license. That don't mean it will have a deal. All that America did was put the ball in Venezuela's court. Well, they didn't even necessarily give us a license back yet. They didn't give us back an OFAC license. But yes, they did put the ball in Venezuela's court. Now, here's the thing, and this is part of the thing that, ironically, if it's not true, the government would not want it to be revealed because it would make their life harder, right? Because Arima asked the question, you know, so they bad talk the man and now they have to go deal with them? How does that work? Well, here's the thing. The conspiracy theory is there's going to be regime change, and that's why they're doing this do, right? Here's the problem. If that becomes a common believed sentiment, a common believed narrative, if weight is given to that, even with no evidence, and it doesn't happen, because it's one of those things where I'll only believe it if I see it, right? If it doesn't happen, but everyone believes that it was going to happen, including Venezuela, that makes TNT's government's attempt to get a deal done a lot harder. Because they'll be like, but they want to kill me. And you want to make demands on me on top of that? No, I am dealing with all of you because we will, to some extent, be lumped in with America based on how everything has gone. The fact that the Prime Minister used the same terminology that Marco Rubio used to describe, I believe it was Marco Rubio used to describe Nicolas Maduro as a narco-terrorist. Let's take the next comment. If Venezuela will say no and let the people suffer, or will Venezuela think about the people? That's a good question. Well, first of all, they might say yes and still let the people suffer because they'll pocket the money, right? Corruption is not a TNT monopolized thing. It's not limited to certain states like Russia or China. It's not limited to big capitalist countries like North America, like the United States or whatever. You'll find it everywhere. And in a country like Venezuela, it's even easier. One would think, one would hope that they will have an incentive to say, let's get a deal done, but they would want to be compensated in a way that makes sense to them. And that's based on what Marco Rubio, what his statements entail. From what I understand, America is not ready to give us that license. Yeah, Chiu Young pointed out, they gave us, initially, we weren't able to pay with cash. It was in kind, right? Whatever that means. It wasn't clear to me how we would have, what we offered to give for the gas. I just know that it couldn't have been cash. But then eventually, we did get a license that allowed us to pay for the gas. But that didn't last long enough to actually get the ball rolling and start the project. So we have to wait and see. It's regime change. So we actually have, with regards to our own selfish needs, regime change can benefit us. Not having regime change can benefit us. We just need to not necessarily try to hedge our bets on this one, I think, right? And not pick the wrong side, and that's a loaded statement there. Don't ask me to explain it because we have San Fernando on the line. I still have more things to say, but San Fernando first, good morning, call you on here.
Morning, Sean.
Morning.
The question we have to ask ourselves with all this issue with shots being fired, good and bad for the Venezuela, this dragon gas deal with Venezuela, we have to ask ourselves, what is the incentive that Venezuela has to give us their gas now? What incentive do they have?
Oh, yes.
And that is where we need to frame the question.
Yes, exactly.
Or to look for the answer. Because Venezuela has repaired all the refineries with the help of China, and they're up and running now. Because Venezuela now exports about 900,000 barrels, a little over 900,000 barrels a day to China, about almost 300,000 barrels a day to India, and a lot of other things that are going on in Venezuela. Venezuela is not in a in the situation that they were 3 years ago, 4 years ago. You find the economic situation.
Right.
So the incentive to do a dragon deal is less than now than when Stuart Young and they were negotiating this dragon deal with Venezuela. So Venezuela now looks at the rhetoric. Now the thing is that the burden of proof is on us. This is what you all want from us, and this is how you all behaving and saying about our leadership. So this government has to understand, which they have never understood under the last IPA partnership. They don't understand diplomacy and how far diplomacy can go in terms of getting something that you need from another country. So they have to now deploy their diplomacy. Shut your mouth and start to work from the background. This hoorah because Marco Rubio says something. The gas is not Marco Rubio, it's not US gas. You have to cut a deal with Venezuela, and you are now in a worse position than you would just because of the economic strength of Venezuela that they have been gaining. So if we really want this deal, we really have to jump through some hoops. And I want to say one other thing. If they think Venezuela does not know what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago, it's not about the internet. I can assure you that the Bolivarian intelligence service called the SIBIN is in Trinidad and Tobago and has been in Trinidad and Tobago because they have a lot of citizens here and they understand how important it is to know what's happening around the neighbors. So this government needs to be very careful how they negotiate, how they go about opening their mouths. Because this situation, we right now, we don't have a plan B, We don't have a plan B. Our only plan B is God's at Trini. That's the plan B right now. Nothing else.
I hate to say this, that might be plan A.
I hope that they understand this and they try their best to employ diplomacy and stop trying to pick a fight with everybody around us. Have a good day, Sean.
Thank you, caller. I hate to say this, but God is a Trinity might be plan A, B, C, D, and E, and the dragon gas might just be a supplement. The incentive for Venezuela to give gas for unfavorable compensation probably doesn't exist. Because like I said earlier, when you give gas, you will never get it back. You will never make it back. You will never earn it back. It's a finite resource. Once it's gone, it's gone. So that's what makes the math on these things, the economics behind these things a lot different. It's not even like gold, where you could technically buy back the gold. Gas is used. The thing is, it's hard not to think. We have another comment. Let's put up this comment again, because this goes into what I'm going to say. Good day. Can someone explain to me how the Prime Minister will accomplish a dragon gas deal that must not benefit Venezuela? Moreover, the Prime Minister and the UNC demonized the Maduro government and now expect Venezuela to react favorably. And that's what we've been saying on this topic, most of us, right? Again, you can't necessarily fault Stuart Young. Don't shoot down the message because of the messenger. That would be oversimplistic thinking, short-sightedness. And on the whole Venezuelan issue, I wonder if the government really did not think things through. And this is not the first time I've said this about politicians. I've said this about PNM politicians as well. But think about it. It seems as though because of domestic politics, maybe you could sprinkle in a little bit of how they want to craft their relationship with America. But that also could be based on domestic politics, right? What is the domestic politics? The PNM seem to be closer to the Democratic administration of Joe Biden and maybe any other Democratic administration. The PNM seem to be willing to conduct deals with Nicolas Maduro, who the Democratic side of the American government was more willing to treat with as opposed to a Trump-led Republican government, particularly a Trump-led government, right? The PNM had a meeting with Delcy Rodriguez, which the United States Embassy pointed out that's kind of against our treaty. The PNM administration potentially was negotiating on behalf of, for our own benefits, yes, said regime, and was engaged in good faith relations, which, depending on how you view the Nicolas Maduro government, is that really someone you want to be associated with? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, right? So because that's the stance the PNM took, what does local politics say you do? What's the local politics playbook? They make a Cuba hospital, don't open the Cuba hospital, right? They have a new airport in Tobago, well, I don't know how close it is to finish, but it could very easily be speculated, given the limited public communication of the matter, don't open the new airport. In fact, I'll say this, the People's Partnership Administration took a lot of flack for Napa, but that was a Manning project. And whoever sold Mr. Manning on the Napa and the diplomatic center's performance space, and Napa on a whole, as viable entities that were fit for purpose, the fact of the matter is, no, they were not fit for purpose. They did not conform to various basic conventions of designing a performing arts space. The diplomatic center was even worse. It was very poorly designed. A sound booth should never be up in a corner, away from the audience, next to the stage, so you can't hear what the audience hears. So how are you going to balance the sound for the audience? You're balancing the sound for how it sounds in the corner of the stage. You're not even facing the stage, so how do you follow cues of what's going on in the stage? And there was another booth that I speculated could have been the lighting booth, and that's not facing the stage. How does that make sense? And then Napa had its own issues. Analog machinery, poor internal layout design. You have loading doors that have no external doors that could allow you to bring in anything large into their humongous backstage that you literally, the access point is normal double door size doors, not a proper loading bay door externally to the building. The curtains were of interesting design. There was a lot of things that made it a subpar space to put on shows. And to some extent, it was almost like Kamala was trying to hide it. It's like, why are you hiding it? You didn't build it. Did you sign off on some of these things? I don't understand. I'm pretty sure somebody sold the previous government to you a bad set of goods, and why are you kind of shy about it? There's this whole thing about other people's projects. We have to, or dollar for dollar, all right, then we'll make it the whole thing free. Either we hide your project or we one-up you. Or in very rare cases, we kind of treat it so bad, we take blame for it. And maybe that's fair, right? But the PNM had a stance on Venezuela, and it seemed like the UNC was very determined to have the opposite stance. And there was a point in time where it seemed as though it would have been fine, but now chickens come home to roost, apparently. And it goes back to what Mr. Sanfano said. Do they really understand diplomacy? Because when your domestic politics is potentially dictating your foreign relations, that is difficult for me to say, to describe that as being smart. We have Faisal on the line. Good morning, caller, you're on here. Last call.
Good morning, Sean.
Morning.
Good morning to you. Sean, I listened to the commentators with respect to this Dragon deal and the UFAC license. Clearly, when Mr. Kyotyong went up to the USA to meet Mr. Rubio, they would have held discussion, and coming out of that discussion, the license was revoked. There must be reasons for that. Those are the reasons we do not have at hand. However, the Honorable Prime Minister went back, was invited, she went, and the deal is back on the table. That doesn't say yea or nay to whether Mr. Maduro is going to accede to the request of the Honorable Prime Minister. So it is still in a negotiation stage. What was passing strange is that soon as the Trump administration came into power, Dr. Rowley chose to resign within 2 weeks of the administration in power. Doesn't that kind of lead you to some sort of suspicion? I mean, all the armchair politicians that we have in Trinidad who want to pass judgment, I never hear them commented on that. It is strange. So I am thinking the Prime Minister is very right to say Trinidad and Tobago first. We never had the Dragon Deal. We are in the process of trying to acquire it. But in the meantime, we cannot neglect the safety and the security of our country. Remember, America is our #1 ally and our #1 trading partner. To go against the wishes of the Americans willy-nilly will be foolhardy. We could probably end up like Haiti. And I heard one of your caller earlier mention about the lying politicians. I want to remind him of Dr. Rowley's statement, we will not be closing down Petrotrin. That was one of the major economic blows to this country. Why are we not remembering that? Well, so I am hoping that everything goes well with the negotiation on the Dragon Deal. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you, caller. I'll say this. I can understand if you want to respond to him under certain contexts that way. That's fine. With regards to this discussion, that technically will include myself and all of the other viewers, whatever Rowley did and potentially lied about does not disprove or make better whatever Kamala Prasad-Bissessar did or did not lie about. Those are two separate things. They could both lie, they're both wrong, they could both not lie, right? One doesn't really affect the other. This tit for tat thing, you lied, no, you lied. That's not how it's supposed to work really if we want to be truly objective. Whether Dr. Rowley lied on something or not does not make, yes, it might make Kamala look better or worse, relatively speaking, but she should not be judged at least only by on a curve based on the performance of other politicians. Especially now when our situation is probably worse than it was before. And yes, that is not necessarily her fault, although one could argue opposition is part of the government, takes two to tango, blah, 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 blah. But we don't have the time to get into that. The issue with regards to this is not that the government put Trinidad first, it's that they're inconsistent on it. Their stance wasn't necessarily wrong in the sense of Dragon was dead. When they said Dragon was dead, Dragon was dead. We said Dragon was dead. Karen and I are still saying Dragon is dead now. Dragon is still dead. Yes, the Americans might have dug up the corpse, but the corpse is decaying, right? We don't just need CPR. We need all kind of miracle drugs to get this thing back breathing. And it's the inconsistency, because I get it. Dragon is dead. I have no problem with you doing that. It was the PNM's project. As much as they don't want to say they put all their eggs in that basket, they put too many eggs in it, fine. Well, the bubble there wasn't technically wrong. It's just that now it's inconsistent when you say, oh no, we have great relations with Venezuela. Do you really? Does anybody truly believe that statement? I said she has to say it. That doesn't mean that it's true. That's one of the interesting things about international relations. It goes to a point I wanted to make all the way back to the first caller with regards to a lot of the commentary on United States Venezuela. And he pointed out the fact that, Mr. Digicel pointed out the fact that according to one Guyanese businessman, CARICOM leaders are traitors to CARICOM. That's how I view it, right? And I'll say this, I think a lot of our local academics and political figures, they don't really understand international politics on the level of the big boys. So when they want to speak on it with any degree of authority, what is the basis of that? You read something in a book? Were you there? Did you ever participate in high-level negotiations between America and the Soviet Union or the various nations in Europe amongst each other? I mean, we could be big shots in our little pond, but it's a little pond. And I've already outlined where I think our local politicians are deficient. Politicians in other Caribbean states, bigger or smaller, we're all small, we're all limited in experience, regardless of what our international public personas of our people are. Because if you could complain about the head of the WHO and the IMF and the American politicians and British politicians, who are we? Less experienced, less practiced in these things. And that's why a lot of what our local people say comes off as somewhat idealistic and limited. And that also could be in line with what I'm saying about the current administration. They were premature and gung-ho with what they said, and now they have to walk it back to the point where one of their ministers was still on that bandwagon, and the Prime Minister had to basically say, I don't agree with that. She probably knew what was happening, or got hints of what the US Secretary of State was going to say, but that could be a smokescreen. Because the ball technically is in Venezuela's courts. They haven't given us a license from OFAC yet. But technically, they have positioned themselves to say, well, Venezuela, what are you going to do? It's not us. We're not the ones who keeping you back. It's Venezuela keeping you back. They have played politics potentially with us in this situation where now they are technically not the bad guys based on the simple narrative. Now, that might be incorrect. This might be done in good faith, or it might just be a way to kind of push the ball in someone else's court so they don't have to deal with it. Kick the can down the road. It's not my problem. Not my monkey, not my circus. Now, I will caution people, not everything with regards to the budget is going to be corruption and malice. Some of it is just going to be poor governance due to a lack of proficiency. Because really and truly, where do we train our politicians? Who are their mentors? How are they trained? What school did they go to for this? Law school don't prepare for this. Political science school doesn't necessarily prepare you for this. Economics school doesn't necessarily prepare you for this. What prepares you for this? It's a unique job with a unique set of skills that normally is born from experience, but the experience of most of our politicians is engagement in bubble. And to Mr. Claxton Bay, I asked the question from the very beginning, where they're going to get the money from. I did. I can't remember if I asked it before Stuart Young or in parallel with Stuart Young, but from the moment that 10% thing came out the head of the PSA's mouth, I'm like, where are they getting money for that? That was my thought that night. Where are they getting money for that? I've been asking that repeatedly. I don't care if Stuart Young asked it. If you don't like that Stuart Young asked a question, don't shoot the message because of the messenger. Don't disregard the message. Does the message have merit? Now, I don't know if you could put up the comments. I'm not necessarily going to read them out, but I don't know if you could just put it up, that last list. You could kind of see it there. Listen, I get it, caller, but I disagree. There's the one in the middle there, Venezuela has to come to us. I don't think so. I think Venezuela is more than happy. If they can't get cash for their gas, I think they're more than happy to say, we're good. Because we already got that from Venezuela. By the way, Stuart Young said it, perhaps we're hoping for the private companies to kind of push this deal through. But it's Venezuela. They basically took assets from private companies. One could say, oh, they took assets from the colonizers. Boo, hoo, 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 hoo. Listen, if we want to work in a rules-based society, we can't pick and choose the rules when it suits us. To those people that don't want to shed any tears for major corporations having their stuff privatized out from underneath them. You want to be rules-based society? We play by all the rules or none at all. That's essentially what the Prime Minister is saying, right? You're saying the refineries aren't running now. He's saying they are. China is setting it up. It's not impossible. Regardless, dictatorships, of which potentially Venezuela is one, I'm not going to speak in affirmative language now, they will take the loss. The gas, the key thing is that the gas is still there. If they don't sell it to us today, the gas is still there tomorrow. But if they give it away for things that they don't want, that's a loss. So they're more than willing to sit on it, regardless of whether the refineries are operating or not, regardless if they're selling crude oil or not. They don't want to lose on the gas, so it's better to sit on it. There are times when people sit on oil reserves or sit on diamond reserves or sit on gold reserves when the price is too low. If the price for them is too low, why would they come to us? What do we have to offer to them? Because we already have a judge saying, yeah, and what money we're going to give them, you got to take that money to give to ConocoPhillips. So I will end that there. Let me just make sure I mentioned everything. I think I did. There's one more comment there. We'll get to the comments. Let's take the comments. I'm not entirely sure how true this is because machining parts is not necessarily impossible. That's point number one. Point number two, replacing whole systems is not necessarily impossible. And point number three, that doesn't matter. All the refineries could be not working. They could be selling no oil. They could have no money coming through. If the compensation is not enough for a resource like oil and gas, that is essentially the same thing as when the price of oil goes too low, so they stop certain wells operations. They stop certain shade oil operations or what have you. That's why there's rare earth minerals all over the place, but the price is too low. That's why at the time, the China mine was the only one operating. And I think America is going to say we can't strategically depend on that. So regardless of the cost, we'll open our own mine. I don't know if they follow through with that. You assume they care about the suffering of poor people in Venezuela. If that was the case, this whole situation would not have lasted this long. It wouldn't, regardless of who caused it. I think that's one of the things that the average person and all of the idealists and all of the naive public speakers need to understand. At the end of the day, issues at that level are about practical reality and results. Forget about sentiment, forget about nostalgia, forget about personal preference. You could even throw ideology out the window. It comes down to eventually practical results. And a lack of practical results means they don't care enough about it. Why? All right, enough about them. What about us? Budget coming up. We don't know when. Minister of Finance said it should have been announced by now because these things take a lot of time. We have to wait and see. Cutting it close. Maybe they have a lot of hard choices. Depending on how the budget comes out, our perception of the government might change for the good or for the bad. But we've reached the point now where what's the point on jumping the gun? It should be coming in within a week or two. Let's wait, see the budget, have something tangible, and then make up our mind of what we're going to say and how we feel about things in this country moving on from that point. Until then, stay safe. Remember your allegiance to the Republic and to each other. Never forget, try to be nice. When the other person has a different political color than you, be extra nice. Unless they're miserable. In which case, just walk away. Just walk away. Don't try and fight it down. Because we don't want things to get worse unnecessarily before they get better. Paradise, once again, is up to us. Until then, we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
WESN